Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Olivier Gremillon, Managing Director, EMEA for Airbnb.
Thank you.
I really don't like doing this with a handheld mic, but I'm going to. Okay, so first, I just spent a lot of time telling you about you. So I'd just like to ask you, how much did I get wrong? Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being absolutely perfect, I nailed it, and 1 being, well, the other end of the spectrum. Would you like to grade me?
I'll give you 11. No, jokes aside,
Can you say that again?
I think, especially in our industry, there was not a lot of data for a long time, and Phocuswright has provided a lot of interesting data that everybody relies on, all the players, all the investment bankers who started to actually look at the space. So a lot of this data are actually great, and I think you had a very good teaser for your 2017 study. So I don't know how much it goes for, but I'm sure it's going to be a great deal.
Incredible value, absolutely incredible value. So there's one interesting question, I've actually asked this of you every year, and sometimes the answer changes a little bit. So I remember, the very beginning of Airbnb. In fact, from a presentation we got from the founders. Sorry, I got to remember to hold the mic. So a presentation that we got from the founders in 2010. The founders just on this deck described Airbnb as a community marketplace, and then the founders started talking about the company as a hospitality company, and now we're hearing kind of a travel company. Chip has described it. Chip Conley has described the company as a home-sharing company. You're often compared to hotel companies or OTAs. What is Airbnb? How would you describe the company?
Well, I think a little bit of all of the above, but that's true that it has evolved over time because at the very beginning we were mostly a design and tech company. We started to be a hospitality company when we brought our first employee who knew anything about hospitality, and it was Chip Conley, right? And there were already a few hundred employees back then. So I think we switched a little bit from really being tech and design driven to actually starting to understand a bit more the ecosystem around us. And obviously, as we expand beyond the accommodation sector and the traditional and the hospitality sector, we are considering ourselves more as a travel company because now we are providing more services than just accommodation. So we've been pretty public about the fact that we want to take a bigger part in the entire travel from end to end. Obviously, we started with accommodation. We launched in November our trips platform, and then there might be other things we'll do in the future, but we are evolving over time to actually be a more fully rounded travel company.
So let's talk a little bit about trips and in particular experiences. So this was the big launch in November at the Airbnb Open, a kind of a peer-to-peer type of experiences, sort of tours and activities play. How is it going?
It's going well. So it's actually interesting to see how we launched it. So that's true. We launched it in November 2016 in 12 cities. We are now in more than 20 cities, and we want to go up to 51 cities by the end of the year. We have a little bit more than 1,000 experiences that you can book in these 20-plus cities on the platform. And we see some great results. Like the main one that we're looking at is satisfaction. So 90% of the reviews we get are 5-star reviews. And that's really the bar that we want to keep. So we are really trying, and that's why we don't want to go necessarily too fast. We really want to keep a great quality. And that's a lot how this, what started as a project 2 years ago was developed, which is we started by having the vision, and Brian, our CEO especially, who was working on it from the beginning, the vision of creating the perfect trip, the really transformational trip. And then after you do that, how do you, to scale that a little bit? Because obviously, I think the first trip took 2 weeks of 20 people to build. So it's not necessarily the most scalable things, but we really wanted to start from the perfect trip and see afterwards how you can scale it actually down the line.
So I want to ask a little bit about demand. I think especially as we looked at kind of the changes in the rental traveler demographic and how the Airbnb traveler is kind of looking more and more like the Expedia traveler, the booking traveler. So there's one, I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at experiences. There's one in particular that's kind of jumped out at me. And so I found, I think for 30 or 35 bucks, you can do a dreamy jellyfish flash mob in San Francisco. And, I'm just kind of thinking, it's hard for me to imagine paying 30 bucks to do that. And it's hard for me to imagine, lots and lots of travelers doing that. But there's lots of, pretty, let's just say this is not like your typical hop-on, hop-off bus tour type of stuff. What kind of demand are you seeing? Do people really want to do this?
So interestingly enough, there are, sometimes we push some experiences that, nobody wants to book. But other times we were like, this one, who is really going to do that? And you actually find out that many people want to do it. So we're pretty open to the type of experiences. The thing we want is it's something that you do locally. And something that is really true to the city where we do it. But some have been pretty interesting. Like there is a truffle hunting experience that is over 3-day, 250 plus euros. And I think 40 or 50 people have actually done it. It's like 40 minutes out of Florence. It's a commitment for 3 days, but people love it. And I think the rating is like 5-star by everybody who's taken it.
But how do you also scale this on the supply side? A lot of these experiences, I might be a full-time chef or a photographer or something, and then maybe once or twice a week I will do an experience. It's not like I have my accommodation, which it's there all the time, and I can rent it out. And you guys are getting better and better, and ecosystem companies are making it easier and easier for me to kind of do that all the time and optimize that. But there seems to be like a supply constraint. How much supply do you need experiences to be for it to surpass the accommodations business, which is what I think some folks at Airbnb have said is possible?
Yeah, I think the good thing is you don't have to scale it. You don't have to, what I mean by that is you don't have to ask people to do that 365 days a year. And it's very similar to the homes business, actually. When you look at the hosts in Europe, they rent their place for 28 nights a year, not 360. So if somebody does that 28 times in a year, that's fine too. The reason for this is, they might have another job, or most of them do, they have other occupation. If they do that once a month or twice a month, that's okay. As soon as you have enough supply to actually, tailor to all the demand that you are going to bring. But we had the same questions with the homes business back in the days where, hey, somebody is going to rent their place for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks during the year. How do you scale it? Like, you're going to need like millions of listings on the platform. And the answer is yes, and that's why we have over 3 million listings. So right now we have 1,000 plus experiences, but we think that a lot of people have a passion in their country, in their city, that they want to make others discover. And if there are like a few people doing truffle hunting because the person doing it right now is going to do that only once a month, that's fine.
So what about other more conventional attractions? And I mean, if I'm increasingly that typical traveler, I mean, I might want to stay in an Airbnb, but I still want to go to the top of the Empire State Building or Disney World or go to a museum. And actually, we see a lot of Airbnbers are very interested in culture and go to a lot of museums. Is that more traditional type of tours and activities and attractions, is that going to find its way into Airbnb?
To a certain extent, yes. So I was reading an article about a certain travel analyst that I'm going to keep confidential, but let's say he's called Douglas Q. And he was saying, who on hell is going to go and learn violin making in Paris when they actually visit the cities?
I didn't swear, okay?
That's true.
Swear.
That's a good point. That was my translation of it. English is not my first language. But basically, I think it's a fair point. Like, it's not necessarily for everybody, but again, the cost of bringing that on the platform is pretty low, and if it's actually tailored to a few people who actually want to discover violin making in Paris, it's actually good. I think one thing we learned over the past few months is, we're not going to make everybody go to learn violin making overnight, and that's not even our goal. People, when they go to Paris, they'll still want to go and visit the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre and things like that. The thing that we are looking at, though, is can you discover the Louvre in a different way? And one interesting experience that you can find on the platform is a comedian who actually makes you discover the Louvre by, joking around for like an hour or two with other people in the Louvre, and it makes you discover the paintings and the story of the Louvre in a funny way. Well, that one is an interesting one because people are still going to discover the Louvre. It's on their bucket list, and they're going to check that off, but they're going to do that in a different way than just, the other millions of people who are discovering the Louvre every day. So that's really something that we changed a little bit in our thinking. We're evolving the product changes a few times a day. Again, it's a little bit of a startup within the company where it has its own teams, its own focus, its own, engineering team and all that stuff, and they push things very frequently. And sometimes we have great surprise. Like we didn't know, for instance, that music experiences would be that big. It happens that a lot of people want to go to private concerts in home. So that's something that we're actually pushing now, but was not necessarily in the list of things we were thinking of at the beginning.
In the past, Airbnb has had some pretty high-profile incidents in some of the homes. People have been hurt or homes have been damaged or something like that. So let's just say, in theory, I am attacked by a vicious jellyfish and I suffer some type of bodily harm. What do I do? Who pays for my medical bills? Is it the jellyfish tour guide or is it Airbnb?
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to, just on the things that happen on the platform, on the home business, I did my own stats, but it happens that more than 100% of what really happens on the platform gets into the press. So we have a tendency to think that there are a lot of bad things that happen on the platform all the time because you see it in the press quite a bit. But the real number is actually 0.002% of things that happen. And what I define by this is actually the number of claims we get for something for more than $1,000.
That's actually fair, and we've seen that too in our own data. I mean, and this is actually across the rental landscape in general. Like 99.9% of respondents are really satisfied. But there is also the tour guide business is regulated in some markets, and tour guides have to have licenses in some cases, and there are companies that do kind of peer-to-peer like services, so forth. I mean, Urban Adventures and others that tours by locals and so forth that are actually only working with licensed guides. So are all of your experience guides or hosts, are they licensed, or is that an issue? Do they assume liability? How does that work?
Yeah, so there are some of them who are licensed, and it happens that there is not yet a jellyfish mob license out there. So that person, even if they wanted to actually get registered, they couldn't. But there are things that we do for experienced hosts, which is provide them with a host liability insurance in case some of the stuff that you mentioned happens. So we're looking at both fronts, which is what are the type of regulation, licenses, insurances that exist, but then on top of that, we actually cover for the stuff that can happen.
So just a bigger question on just kind of regulation in general. We actually had a whole session earlier this morning on regulation, and I think Airbnb consumed about half of the discussion. It seems like it's in some ways becoming a bigger issue, but it's also highly localized, it seems, from market to market. And it's actually interesting. I think the city we're in now, Amsterdam, was one of the pilot cities for an initiative that you had to collect hospitality taxes and to work with the local authorities. So can you maybe just kind of give a macro sense of your strategy around regulation, how you guys are approaching it?
Yes, our strategy from very early on, so I joined the company in 2012, and one of the first things I did was actually to go and introduce myself to the Paris City Hall back then, was to actually talk to people. And I think I mentioned that in one of the previous Phocuswright conferences, is the first time I went to the City Hall, the person I was meeting told me, your biggest enemy is ignorance. And what he meant by that is a lot of people were already talking about Airbnb in certain circles, and they were telling a certain story, which was not necessarily the full picture. So he said, hey, you should actually get out there and actually talk to people. So, fast forward to 2017, we made a little bit more than 300 different agreements with like cities and regions and global governments and stuff like that. On the tax front, because you mentioned that, we are collecting in more than 275 different jurisdictions. And for the past 12 months, it's been more than $250 million that we actually gave back to the cities in tourist tax, hotel tax, occupancy tax, however you want to call it. So, we have an approach of, hey, we want to talk to the different governments, especially when they are pragmatic, especially when they have identified an issue, which is tax collection, which is many other things, and they want to solve it. My cynical way sometimes is it's not always the case. Sometimes they don't necessarily want to solve an issue. Sometimes they want to get some brownie points in the press. But for most of them, they really want to solve some specific issues that they identified, and we're more than happy to work with them on this.
What about in the case of the multi-unit listings? I mean, this has been, I think, a source of controversy, especially in urban markets and with hotel organizations where it's basically residential inventory that is not regulated the same way, but it's being largely treated in kind of a commercial or hospitality context. What is the balance, right? So I think in some markets we've seen a real pushback, and you've had to pull some inventory from the marketplace, from Airbnb. What does kind of reasonable regulation look like in the case of those multi-unit operators?
Yeah, I think the overall framework that a lot of cities are moving towards is differentiating people who actually rent out their place for 28 days a year, as I was mentioning earlier, and they make, on average, 2,400 euros, from people who are actually buying an entire building, renting it out entirely. This is much closer to hotels, this is much closer to a traditional hospitality business, and they should be regulated as such. It doesn't mean that, it shouldn't exist, right? Like some people, apart hotels, for instance, is exactly this. You take an entire building, and instead of putting some hotel rooms, you put something that looks like more of an apartment. So this should exist, but the cities have the right, obviously, to say we want a certain number of this, and we want to regulate them in a certain way. It's very different from, hey, I'm going on vacation next week and I'm going to rent my place for 4 or 5 days. So that's a little bit the way the cities approach it, which I think is smart. Is it like something you do on an occasional basis, or is it a professional activity, and it should be regulated differently?
You're also, you're actually pushing away, in a way, into some markets where the supply really is multi-unit inventory. You're pushing into the vacation rental market. You've got some agreements, I think, in corporate housing, for example, in some cases. What does, if I'm now renting out one of 1,000 kind of units on Airbnb, what happens to that kind of travel like a local, that kind of connecting with the local experience? How does that connect to that brand message that we've all been accustomed to?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Like first, there are not that many people who own 1,000 places, so most of the time it's somebody managing it for somebody else.
Well, these are the property managers, right? And we've seen in our work, huge growth in the percentage of property managers in the US and Europe that are now, listing on Airbnb.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example. Last weekend, I had some friends from California who were visiting us, and they put their place because they have a chance to actually travel for 2 months in Europe. So they put their place on Airbnb, and somebody is managing them for them. A company who is actually helping take the pictures and putting them, doing the check-in, the check-out, the laundry, and whatever. It happens that our friends are still the ones messaging. It's just somebody helps them to take care of the house when they are not there. Obviously, when it's a secondary residence and when you are gone for an extended period of time, you can't welcome people yourself. So there is an entire ecosystem that has been created around this practice, whether the property managers, and they existed much longer, before Airbnb existed, or this check-in, check-out, laundry, companies who are actually providing you a way to actually rent when you are not there. So that's one piece. The vacation areas, there are some people who are renting out their place in vacation areas, whether it's ski resorts or next to the sea. when it's like their primary residence or it's their secondary residence, and some others have like multi-units. So it's really a mixed bag of many different things, but there is not necessarily a correlation between it's in vacation areas and it's not going to be personal in the relationship you have. The house I rented last summer in the southwest of France, I saw the host was their primary residence. They went to their in-laws for the week when we were there, and I saw them for an hour, and they provided me like amazing tips that made my trip very different. So there are a lot of different things like that, and multi-units doesn't necessarily mean bad experience either. It's just something different, and somebody else is actually providing it.
Douglas, we do have a question.
Hi, Olivier. This is Sarah from Hospitality Insight in Germany. I have a quick question regarding new regulations happening in France. And I would like to know if you, first of all, if it's going to impact your portfolio, and if you, in the future, going to have to decrease your portfolio in France, which is one of your biggest destinations.
So France has been one of the first countries to do what I was saying earlier, which is differentiate the people renting their primary residence. Basically, the law in 2014 was saying if you do that, you can actually, as soon as it's your primary residence, do a little bit whatever you want. You don't need to have specific, registration permits or stuff like that. When you do it in a secondary residence or when you invest in a property, you should actually, there are a few more steps to actually follow in some jurisdiction. The thing I guess you are referring to is the fact that now the cities can actually have the potential to ask you to register if you want to. And our position on this is we don't necessarily think it's the easiest way to regulate, but if it's a simple registration process that we put in place, we'll see what it looks like. But there are a lot of ways to regulate, some of them where you have to go through a multi-step process for registration, and some others, like the ones we have implemented in a few places, where we can actually take care of some of the enforcement by capping you, for instance, at a certain level. So there are a lot of these discussions obviously happening. We obviously have a point of view on the fact that technology can help with some of the enforcement, but that's the discussion we have ongoing with the different cities and countries.
So
the question is, there are a lot of people subletting in some places. Yes, it happens that in some countries, France being one, subletting is not illegal as soon as you have the authorization from your landlord. And that's a shift that we see as well. A lot of people start to realize that, hey, you know what? If it's a way to make my tenants, if I'm sure that they're going to pay me because they can make a little bit of money when they're gone on weekends, more and more landlords actually say, yeah, it's actually fine if you actually sublet when you go on vacation.
As you push into some of these other markets and other market segments, and you obviously need to grow supply, do or will hotels have a home on Airbnb?
So we do have hotel. It's not a scoop. We do have some hotels on Airbnb. So some that have been there for a little bit of time because it's an open platform. So some of them signed up like a few years ago, and we even made a deal with Chateau Hotel and Collection, the brand whose president is Alain Ducasse, the famous chef. And the reason why we did a deal specifically with this brand is because we think that a lot of the values are actually very close to ours. So if you look at a typical Chateau Hotel Collection property, it's like 5, 10, 15 rooms in the middle of in the middle of a rural area in France and in a few other countries, where you have the owner of a place who is a host on Airbnb, providing you some experience, local experience, like using local produces. And we think that a lot of this is actually very aligned with what we do. The line is very blurry between somebody who has a castle, who rents 3 or 4 rooms in their castle, and somebody who has a hotel, which is a castle as well, who
but we are
rents
seeing, though,
7 or 10 rooms.
But we are seeing, though, that clearly from Booking and Expedia, they are moving into this and trying to get your type of inventory onto their platform because they see consumers want all of this stuff and they want to provide more choice. But you are not. So we're not going to see Marriott, Hilton, Hyatt, nor even a mid-sized chain.
No, you're not going to see the big chains anytime soon. I think there are some specific boutique hotel, some specific type of traditional hospitality provider that we are talking with and we are putting on the platform to test how things are going. And I think again because they provide local experience and authentic experience, but it's not going to be no, you're not going to see the type of properties that you see on other platforms.
We have a question and a mic that doesn't work.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hi, I work for a French media called Travel and Move. I have a killer question for you, Olivier. There is a lot of rumors. Are you really developing flight booking tool?
That was one of my questions, by the way. You're not allowed to do that.
So yeah, again, we announced that we want to take a bigger part of the entire end-to-end trip. So obviously, transportation is one of them. I think the flights, is your question, I'm going to announce that we are launching a flight booking tool tomorrow? No. The thing we're looking at is the same way we have changed in our mind, like a little bit the accommodation space, the same way we are trying to change the way you experience a specific city. Can we actually do that for flights? Flights is one of these experiences, and for some of you who are actually flying back from Schiphol afterwards, you most likely got an email saying, please show up 3 hours in advance because the lines are going to be long. So you start being in the lines at Schiphol, and then afterwards you go on an experience that is pretty much the same in every airline, and is not necessarily the most enjoyable one, whether you are in economy, in business, or in first. So we are just at this stage thinking of, hey, what could it mean to actually change the way people experience flights? But there is not much more than that at this stage.
We have one more question.
Hi, Pete Rowan from Yapstone. We've heard the last 2 days that Airbnb keeps a lot of companies awake at night. What keeps Airbnb awake at night?
That's a great question.
That's indeed a great question. So,
Phocuswright.
I think a lot, obviously we look at the competition, we look at what others are doing, we look at how we could be disrupted ourselves because, apparently we've been nominated as the top 1 disruptor yesterday or 2 days ago. But there is for sure somebody who is actually somewhere doing something that's going to make our life difficult at some point. But I think the main thing we're looking into as we grow is how can we remain nimble, how can we remain flexible and fast. And that's a little bit why internally, when we launched our trips platform and our experiences, our places, all of these new products that we launched in November, Brian, our CEO, decided that it was something he would focus on primarily. Because that's something that needs to be done from the top, that needs the mandate and the momentum that only the CEO and the founder can bring. And that was a deliberate choice because we're becoming a slightly bigger company with more processes, with more organization, with 20 offices globally. And that's the thing that keeps us awake at night a little bit, which is how can we make sure that we continue to evolve, that we continue to find some new ways to make the travel experience better. So,
last question I have to ask. You probably can't answer it. However, Brian Chesky made a comment. I think that you're about halfway through a 2-year process towards an IPO. What does that mean?
Well, it can mean a lot of things. So, no, there is no clear timetable on, when or why or, whether we would go for an IPO. I think we have quite a little bit of money in the bank, so we are not burning a lot of cash, and we raised quite a lot of cash. So there is no rush in actually doing any IPO. So nothing to announce at this stage.
So you're just a cool cat. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Olivier Gremillon.
Thank you.